I never believed in the supernatural. To me, ghosts, spirits, and all that creepy stuff were just stories people told to scare each other. But everything changed when my family moved into our new house. It was a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, the perfect place to settle down, or so I thought. The first night in the house felt normal. We unpacked a few boxes, had dinner, and went to bed. But the next morning I noticed something strange. The armchair in the living room had been moved. I remember clearly placing it near the window, but now it was facing the couch. I brushed it off, thinking maybe one of us had moved it and forgotten. Later that day, I asked my wife, Sarah, if she had moved the chair. She looked at me, confused, and said she hadn't touched it. Our kids, Emma and Jake, were too small to have moved such a heavy chair, so I let it go. Maybe I was just tired from all the unpacking and didn't remember moving it myself. But that night, something else happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I could hear soft creaking sounds from downstairs. It was as if someone was walking around the living room. I sat up, listening closely, but the sound stopped. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. After all, old houses make noises, right? The following morning, things got weirder. The coffee table had shifted from its usual spot. It wasn't a huge difference, just a few inches to the left, but enough for me to notice. I mentioned it to Sarah again, but she shrugged it off. "It's probably just one of the kids bumping into it," she said, but I wasn't so sure. That night I stayed up late, determined to catch whatever was moving our furniture. I sat on the couch with the lights off, my eyes fixed on the coffee table. Hours passed and nothing happened. I was about to give up when I heard it again, the soft creaking of the floorboards. My heart pounded as I strained to see through the darkness. Suddenly the coffee table moved. Not much, just a little nudge, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I jumped up and turned on the lights, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I checked on Sarah and the kids, but they were sound asleep. I couldn't explain it. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. The next few nights were the same. Every morning, the furniture in the living room was rearranged in small, subtle ways. A chair turned slightly, a table moved a few inches. At first, it was just the living room, but soon, other rooms were affected too. Our bedroom, the kitchen, even the kids' rooms. It was as if something was playing with us, moving things just enough to be noticed, but never enough to be obvious. I started staying up every night, trying to catch whatever was doing this, but every time the movements would happen when I wasn't looking. I'd hear the creaks, but by the time I turned around, it was too late. I began to see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, just fleeting glimpses, but enough to send chills down my spine. I told Sarah about the shadows, but she dismissed it, saying I was probably just tired. But I knew what I saw. Something was in our house, and it was toying with us. One morning, after another sleepless night, I decided to do some research. I searched for stories of haunted houses, poltergeists, anything that could explain what was happening. To my surprise, I found several accounts of people experiencing similar things. Furniture moving on its own, strange noises at night, shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. I read about how spirits or entities could attach themselves to a house or even an object. Sometimes they were harmless, just mischievous, but other times they were malevolent. I began to wonder if we had brought something into the house when we moved. Maybe one of the old pieces of furniture we'd picked up at the thrift store was cursed. The thought terrified me, but I didn't want to alarm Sarah or the kids. I kept my suspicions to myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. One night, about a month after the strange occurrences started, things took a terrifying turn. I was lying in bed half asleep when I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I shot out of bed, my heart racing. Sarah woke up too, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded and grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed. Together we crept downstairs, expecting to find that one of the kids had knocked something over. But what we saw was far worse. The entire living room had been turned upside down. The couch was flipped over, the coffee table smashed against the wall, and all the chairs were scattered around the room. I stood there in disbelief. There was no way this was just furniture shifting on its own. Something or someone had done this. "Call the police," I whispered to Sarah, my voice trembling. She nodded and rushed to grab her phone, but just as she dialed, the lights flickered and went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound the rapid beating of my heart. The house was completely dark, and the only light came from Sarah's phone screen. My hands trembled as I held the baseball bat tighter, ready for whatever was waiting in the shadows. We stood there, not moving, listening. The silence was deafening, but I could feel something cold. It was as if the temperature had dropped drastically in the room. Suddenly I heard the creak of a floorboard. It was slow, deliberate. My heart raced as I turned towards the noise. The faint glow of Sarah's phone didn't reveal much, but I could sense that something was there. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. The cold presence seemed to follow me, wrapping around me like an invisible shroud. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response, only silence. Sarah stood frozen behind me, her eyes wide with fear. We both knew that whatever was in our house wasn't human. We stayed in that living room for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the lights to come back on. Finally, the power flickered back, and with it, a wave of relief washed over me. But the furniture was still in disarray, and the feeling of being watched lingered. When the police arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They checked the house, shining their flashlights in every corner, but there was no sign of an intruder, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. Just our turned-over furniture and two terrified people standing in their living room. The officers told us it was likely an electrical issue that caused the flickering lights and suggested that maybe the kids had knocked over the furniture. They promised to patrol the area, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They left us with a "call if you need anything" and drove away. I knew we weren't dealing with an intruder. This was something far worse. That night, neither Sarah nor I slept. We stayed up in bed, our ears alert for any noise, any sign that whatever was in the house was still there. Every little creak, every shift of the wind outside made me jump. My eyes were heavy, but there was no way I could close them. Not when something had the power to tear apart our living room. Around 3 a.m., just when I thought maybe we'd made it through the night without any more incidents, I heard a soft, dragging sound. It came from right outside our bedroom door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Sarah grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. It was as if something was being pulled across the floor, something heavy. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. We waited for what felt like hours, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no more dragging, just silence. I finally mustered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but the cold feeling lingered. The next morning, I sat at the breakfast table, bleary-eyed and exhausted. Sarah was the same, her face pale and drained from lack of sleep. Emma and Jake, however, seemed unfazed. They ate their cereal like nothing had happened. It wasn't until halfway through breakfast that Emma said something that chilled me to the bone. "Daddy, I don't like the man who visits at night," she said innocently, her spoon halfway to her mouth. I froze. "What man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The one who moves the furniture," she said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "He comes in and makes everything different. Sometimes he sits by my bed and watches me sleep." Sarah dropped her spoon and I felt my stomach turn. "Emma, when did you see this man?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Every night," Emma replied, not even looking up from her cereal. Jake nodded in agreement. "He's nice. He doesn't say anything, just moves stuff around." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The kids had been seeing this thing, this man, the whole time, and they thought it was normal. That was the final straw. I couldn't just sit around and do nothing while some spirit, or whatever it was, messed with my family. I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. Maybe there was something in the past that could explain what was happening. I spent hours online searching for any records, stories, or information about the house or the land it was built on. I combed through old newspaper archives, local history blogs, anything I could find. Finally, I came across a mention of a man who had lived in the house decades ago. His name was David Mullins, and according to the article, he had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His wife had found their furniture rearranged one night, just like ours, but when she went to check on him, David was gone. They never found his body. I felt a chill run down my spine. Could it be him? Was David Mullins still in the house, moving the furniture like he had before he disappeared? I told Sarah everything I had found. She was as horrified as I was. We couldn't live like this anymore, constantly terrified of what would happen at night. So we decided to bring in a medium, someone who could maybe connect with whatever or whoever was in our home. The medium, a woman named Lydia, arrived the next day. She was calm and confident, which put me at ease, though I was still skeptical. She walked through the house, her eyes closed, as if she were feeling for something. When she reached the living room where most of the activity had occurred, she stopped. "There's a presence here," Lydia said softly. "It's not evil, but it's not at peace. It's confused, lost." Sarah and I exchanged nervous glances. "The man you've been sensing, he's tied to this house. He's trying to reach out, but he doesn't know how," Lydia explained. "He doesn't understand that he's no longer alive." Lydia sat down in the middle of the living room, motioning for us to join her. She closed her eyes and began to speak in a soft, soothing voice, as if addressing someone unseen. "David," she called out, "if you're here, we want to help you. Tell us what you need." The air felt heavy, like something was shifting. Then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was trying to communicate. "He wants you to know he didn't mean to frighten you," Lydia said suddenly, her eyes still closed. "He's been searching for something that was taken from him." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What was taken?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lydia paused for a moment as if listening. "His family. He's looking for his wife and child. He doesn't understand why they're not here." Lydia's words sent a wave of sadness through the room. David Mullins wasn't a malevolent spirit, just a lost soul, endlessly searching for his family. I thought back to the articles I had read. His wife had found the furniture moved, but there was no mention of a child. It made me wonder if something had happened to their child before David's disappearance. "He thinks they're still here," Lydia continued. "He's confused, trapped in a loop. The furniture moving. He's trying to recreate the life he had with them." The weight of what she said hit me hard. This wasn't some vengeful entity. This was a father, a husband, trapped in our house, endlessly reliving his final moments. I couldn't imagine the torment he must have felt, unable to find the ones he loved most. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. Lydia opened her eyes, a sad smile on her face. "He needs to be told that they're gone, that it's time for him to move on." That night, we followed Lydia's instructions. She said we needed to speak directly to David to make him understand that his family was no longer here. I didn't know how to talk to a ghost, but we had no other option. Sarah and I sat in the living room, the room where the most activity had occurred, and waited. The silence was overwhelming, and every creak of the house made me jump. Finally, I spoke up. "David," I said, my voice trembling, "we know you're here. We know what you're looking for. But your family, they're not here anymore. They've moved on." The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder. I glanced at Sarah, who was gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a soft, anguished moan, like a man in pain. "They're gone, David," I said again, louder this time. "You don't have to stay here anymore. You can go be with them. It's okay." The lights flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a shadow in the corner of the room. It was tall, vaguely human-shaped, but before I could focus, it disappeared. After that night, things changed. The furniture stopped moving. The house was quieter, less oppressive. It was as if David had finally understood that his family was gone, and that he could move on. For the first time in weeks, Sarah and I slept through the night without any disturbances. I still felt uneasy, as though part of me expected something to happen. But the days passed, and nothing did. One morning, about a week later, I noticed something strange. The armchair in the living room had been moved slightly, just like in the beginning. At first, I felt a jolt of fear, wondering if everything was starting again. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't random. The chair was angled towards the window, where the morning light streamed in. It looked peaceful, almost intentional. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like it was David's way of saying goodbye. After that last movement, everything went back to normal. The strange noises stopped, the cold presence disappeared, and the shadows that had lurked in the corners were gone. It was as if the house had finally been freed from the weight of David's presence. Sarah and I began to feel at ease again. We could sit in the living room without looking over our shoulders, sleep through the night without waking up in terror. Emma and Jake stopped talking about the man who visited at night, and they went back to being carefree kids. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had happened. David wasn't just a ghost. He had been a part of our lives, even if for a short time. I found myself thinking about him, wondering what had happened all those years ago, and hoping that wherever he was now, he had found peace. Even though the hauntings had stopped, I couldn't let go of the mystery of David Mullins. His disappearance had been a cold case for decades, but now that I knew what had happened to him, or at least part of the story, I felt compelled to learn more. I went back to my research, digging even deeper into the history of the house and the Mullins family. I found old census records that confirmed David had indeed lived there with his wife Clara and their son Benjamin. But there was no mention of what had happened to Benjamin. The more I searched, the more I began to piece together a tragic story. It seemed that Benjamin had died young, just a few years before David's disappearance. The cause of his death was never made public, but from the bits of information I could gather, it seemed that Clara had left the house shortly after, possibly overcome with grief. David had stayed behind, alone in the house where he had lost his son. It made sense now, why David was searching for his family. He wasn't just looking for his wife, he was looking for his son, the one he had lost long before his own disappearance. Knowing the full story of David's life and death gave me a sense of closure. I couldn't imagine the pain he had gone through, losing his child and then his family. But I hoped that by helping him understand that they were no longer there, we had given him a chance to finally rest. Sarah and I talked about moving out of the house, but we decided against it. In a strange way, the house felt like it had become part of our family's story, too. We had experienced something that most people never would, and while it had been terrifying, it had also been deeply moving. I still think about David sometimes, especially when I see the armchair by the window, bathed in sunlight. I like to believe that he's finally found the peace he was searching for. Life in the house returned to normal, but it was a new kind of normal. The fear we had felt was replaced with a quiet sense of understanding. We had shared our home with a lost soul, and though it had been terrifying, it had also been an experience that brought our family closer together. Emma and Jake stopped mentioning the man who moved the furniture, and they went back to playing in the living room without a second thought. Sarah and I began to look at the house not as a haunted place, but as a place where something extraordinary had happened. Every now and then I still think about what Lydia said, that David wasn't evil, just lost. I wonder how many other spirits are out there, trapped between worlds, searching for something they'll never find. It's a thought that both terrifies and fascinates me. Even though the house had returned to a state of calm, I couldn't help but notice small, almost imperceptible changes in my own behavior. Every time I entered a room, I found myself scanning it, checking the positions of furniture. Even if I knew deep down that David had moved on, the fear that something else could start happening again lingered at the back of my mind. Sarah noticed it too. She would occasionally catch me staring at the armchair by the window, lost in thought. One evening, as we sat together after putting the kids to bed, she gently placed her hand on mine. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. her voice soft but tinged with uncertainty. I hesitated before answering. "I think so," I said, "but it's hard to let go of everything that happened. Even though the house feels different, part of me keeps waiting for something to happen again." Sarah nodded. "I feel the same way. It's like we've been on edge for so long that we don't know how to feel safe anymore." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the ticking of the clock on the wall. I realized then that the real challenge wasn't just getting rid of the haunting. It was learning how to live without fear again. A few weeks later, we had an unexpected visitor. Lydia, the medium who had helped us communicate with David, showed up at our door. I was surprised to see her, especially since we hadn't reached out to her since the night we had confronted David's spirit. "I just wanted to check in," Lydia said, her expression warm but serious. "Sometimes even after a spirit moves on, there can be remnants left behind. I wanted to make sure everything is still peaceful here." I invited her in, and we sat in the living room, the same place where she had felt David's presence weeks ago. As we talked, I told her about the last time the furniture had moved and how since then things had been quiet. Lydia listened carefully, nodding as I spoke. When I finished, she stood up and slowly walked around the room, her eyes closed, as if she were feeling for something in the air. "There's nothing left here," she said after a few minutes. "David is truly gone, but I do sense that the house holds on to the energy of what happened. It's normal for you to still feel uneasy, but that will fade with time." Her words were comforting, and as she left, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe now, with Lydia's confirmation, I could finally begin to let go of the fear. Just when I thought we were on the path to healing, Emma started having nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night screaming and crying, her tiny body trembling as Sarah and I rushed to comfort her. "The man is back," she would sob, clinging to me. "He's in my room. He's sitting by my bed again." I tried to reassure her, telling her that the man was gone, that he wouldn't come back. But no matter what I said, the nightmares continued. It broke my heart to see her so scared, and I couldn't help but wonder if somehow some part of David's presence had lingered after all. One night, after yet another nightmare, I sat down with Emma and asked her to tell me exactly what she saw. She described the same figure she had mentioned before, a man who sat by her bed watching her sleep. But this time she added something new. "He's crying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He looks sad." A chill ran down my spine. Could it be that David hadn't fully moved on? Or was Emma just reliving the fear we had all experienced? Emma's nightmares hit me harder than I expected. As her father, I felt helpless, like I had failed to protect her from something that should have been long gone. I found myself sitting up late at night, watching over her as she slept, just to make sure there was no sign of the man she kept dreaming about. Sarah tried to reassure me, telling me that it was probably just Emma processing everything that had happened. "She's been through a lot," Sarah said. "It's normal for kids to have nightmares after something like this." But I couldn't shake the guilt. I had brought my family into this house and I hadn't been able to keep them safe from the terror we had experienced. Now, even though the haunting seemed to be over, its effects were still haunting my daughter. One night, as I sat by Emma's bedside, I found myself silently pleading with David. "If you're still here," I whispered, "please, let her be. Let her sleep in peace." I didn't know if he could hear me or if he was even still there, but I had to try. A few nights later, something strange happened. Emma woke up again, but this time she wasn't crying or screaming. Instead, she was calm, almost peaceful. "I saw him again," she told me as I sat on the edge of her bed, "but this time he smiled at me." I felt a lump in my throat. "What did he do?" I asked gently. "He said goodbye," Emma said, "and then he went away." I didn't know what to make of it. Was it just a dream? Or had David finally found the peace he needed thanks to Emma's innocent understanding? Either way, that was the last time she mentioned him. The nightmares stopped, and Emma went back to being her happy, carefree self. It was as if David had finally let go, and in doing so, he had allowed us to let go too. With Emma's nightmares behind us, Life in the house became truly peaceful. The lingering fear that had haunted me for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of closure. Sarah and I focused on moving forward, putting the past behind us and enjoying the simple moments of life with our kids. Every now and then, I would still think about David, about the tragedy he had experienced and the way his spirit had been trapped in our home. But instead of fear, those thoughts now filled me with a sense of empathy. He hadn't been trying to hurt us. He had just been lost, searching for something he would never find. I realized that, in a way, David had helped me too. He had taught me the importance of holding on to the people you love, of never taking for granted the time you have with them. His story had reminded me just how fragile life could be. As time passed, the memory of the haunting began to fade, but it left behind a stronger sense of unity within our family. We had faced something terrifying together, and in doing so, we grew closer. Sarah and I made it a point to spend more time with Emma and Jake, going on family outings, playing games, and simply enjoying the everyday moments that had once seemed insignificant. One evening, as we all sat around the dinner table laughing at one of Jake's silly jokes, I realized how lucky we were. The horrors of the past had taught us to value these small moments, to hold on to them tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, the house was filled with laughter, not fear. But no matter how happy we were, the haunting left an indelible mark on us. It was something we'd never forget. But instead of a painful memory, it had become a reminder of how precious life really is. Though life had returned to normal, I remained curious about the history of our house. After all, David Mullins wasn't just a spirit to us anymore. He was a part of our story. I spent hours researching old documents, local records, and newspaper archives, trying to uncover as much as I could about the Mullins family. It turned out that David's son, Benjamin, had tragically drowned in a nearby lake when he was just 6 years old. After Benjamin's death, Clara, David's wife, couldn't bear to stay in the house. She left, but David remained, haunted by the loss of his son and the disintegration of his family. David himself had vanished one stormy night, and no one ever found out what happened to him. But now, we knew. He had never really left the house. He had been trapped, endlessly replaying his final days, searching for his family. I hoped that wherever he was now, he had finally found peace. For Sarah, the haunting had left her with deep questions about the afterlife and what might happen to us when we're gone. She began attending a local support group for people who had experienced paranormal events, hoping to find others who had lived through something similar. Through these meetings, she found a sense of comfort and connection. Talking about what had happened helped her make sense of it, and over time her anxiety lessened. She even became something of a guide for others, offering advice to people dealing with their own hauntings or spiritual encounters. Sarah's strength and calm during those terrifying weeks had always amazed me, and now, watching her help others find peace, I couldn't have been prouder. Emma and Jake, on the other hand, seemed to forget most of what had happened. Kids are resilient like that. Emma no longer mentioned the man who sat by her bed, and Jake stopped asking questions about the strange things that had once happened in the house. It was as if they had moved on before we even realized it, but every now and then I would catch Emma looking at the old armchair in the living room, the one that had last moved on its own. She never said anything, but I could tell she remembered. Maybe she understood more than we thought. Maybe in her own way, she had come to terms with what had happened. Jake, being younger, seemed to forget it all entirely. He spent his days running around the yard, chasing after the dog, and laughing with the same carefree joy he had always had. It was comforting to know that the events hadn't left any lasting fear in his heart. One evening, long after the last incident, I stood by the window, looking out at the backyard where the kids were playing. The house was quiet, peaceful, and filled with the warmth of family. I felt a sense of relief, knowing that the worst was behind us and that our lives were back on track. But just as I turned away from the window, something caught my eye. The armchair by the window had shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't dramatic or unsettling, just a small adjustment, as though someone had gently moved it to face the setting sun. I stood there for a moment, staring at the chair, my heart racing. But instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of calm. If it was David, it wasn't a warning or a sign of danger. It was peaceful, almost as if he was saying goodbye one last time. I smiled, gave a quiet nod, and turned off the light as I left the room. Whether it was a final message from David or just my mind playing tricks on me, I didn't care. I knew in my heart that he had finally found peace. Years passed, and the haunting became a distant memory, a story we sometimes told friends over dinner, a strange chapter in our lives that almost felt like a dream. The house was no longer a place of fear, but a home where we had built countless happy memories. Looking back, I realized that what we had gone through wasn't just about ghosts or haunted furniture. It was about family, about loss and love, and about finding peace in the face of overwhelming fear. David's story had become intertwined with our own, and in a way, we had helped each other find closure. The house had once been a place of sorrow for David, but now it was a place filled with love and laughter. And I like to think that in some small way, we had given him the peace he had so desperately needed. As I sit here now, writing this final chapter of our story, I feel a sense of closure. The house is quiet, and the kids are asleep upstairs. Sarah is sitting next to me reading a book, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room. The armchair is still by the window, angled just so, as if it's waiting for someone to sit and watch the sunset. But it hasn't moved in years. It's a reminder of what we went through, of the haunting that once terrified us, but also of the peace that followed. David Mullins is no longer here, and neither is the fear. All that remains is the home we've built, filled with love, laughter, and the memory of a spirit who was lost but finally found his way. In the end, we all found peace.